Okay, so questions about the earth shall reel to and fro? No questions?
I got one about Revelations.
Fire.
Is Revelation a imagery about the past and the future, or only the future?
Yes. We encounter a concept in the scriptures about the old heavens, and the idea, the phrase is never used by Peter. I think it's 2 Peter, or is it 3 Peter? Anyway, you can find that out. I'm not much of a scriptorian, okay? I can't quote chapter and verse like so many other people. But he does talk about new heavens and a new earth, and he says that the heavens and the earth in the beginning, he talks about standing out of the water and in the water. He's paraphrasing Genesis. He said, in the old days we had one set of heavens, and heaven and earth. And he says, in the flood, which was the dividing line of history, it all changed, and we got the heavens and the earth that we see now. But he says, in the last days, there will be another destruction that will give us yet a new heaven and a new earth. The same thing, sort of thing, happens in Exodus. In Exodus, we have the water turns to blood. In Revelation, we have the seas turning to blood. In Exodus, we have darkness. In Revelation, we have the sun turning to darkness, sackcloth of hair. There are dozens of similarities. So, the answer is Revelation talks about both. It uses, just as Peter did here, it uses the old situation and the present situation to explain that there will be a new situation. There's this parallelism going on. The same thing with Moses in Exodus and John in Revelation. There's this parallelism going on. And in my first book, I list a whole set of similarities. So, yeah, Revelation is about the past, rehearsing these past common denominators, but in so doing, he also rehearses the fact that the future events are going to look just like the past events, just as Peter wrote about. Yes?
On the two examples you gave, it looks like the one in Revelation is going to be bigger than the one in Exodus.
Yeah. Curiously, something that was taught in the early days of the church after the saints got to the Salt Lake Valley was that there would be a new Exodus and that the saints would gather and return to Jackson County to build New Jerusalem. And that their return, this was commonly believed and spoken of, their return would be exactly the same as the Exodus, only more difficult. More difficult. Yeah, more difficult. Remember that was it John Taylor vision, where he sees the Jackson County area and he says it was swept clean, that when the saints return, there wouldn't be, Brigham Young said it too, there wouldn't be as much as a yellow dog wagging his tail to greet them when they arrive. We think the church moved west to escape persecution, and indeed it did. They had no place else to go. But there is good evidence that Joseph Smith was already talking to many of his early brethren about moving to the Rocky Mountains because that would be safe. If they stayed in Jackson County and the church remained there, it was going to be swept off the face of the land in these latter-day destructions. Yeah.
There's a memorial, but this is the point where I can't remember the name of the brother, but on the memorial, one of the things it says is that Joseph Smith told him that he needs to go to the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah. Well, in this same vision, he sees the people in Salt Lake, and he said there are signs of mourning on every door. I think that's in this book. Maybe it's not. Let me see. See, I don't ever read my own books.
Yeah, it's in the back of one of your books.
You want us to read them?
Yeah, I do. That's right, I sure do. John Taylor, let's see if it's in his vision. I was immediately in Salt Lake City, wandering about the streets in all parts of the city, and on the door of every house I found a badge of mourning, and I could not find a house but what was in mourning. I passed my own house and saw the same sign there, and asked, "Is that me that is dead?" Something gave me an answer, "No, you lived through it." It seemed strange to me that I saw no person on the street in my wandering through the city. They seemed to be in their houses with their sick and dead. I saw no funeral procession or anything of the kind, but the city looked very still and quiet, as though the people were praying and had control of the disease, whatever it was. And then I looked in all directions over the territory, east, west, north, south, and I found the same mourning in every place throughout the land. Well, what he's talking about is the same plague that the Egyptians perished in, but the Israelites were spared, and they celebrated in a yearly event called Passover, and they eat the Seder meal. So there's your parallel. Passover and the events of the last days, as John Taylor saw it in Salt Lake. Salt Lake was preserved, but Jackson County will be swept clean. How? Well, because in the mountains, Rocky Mountains, we have no ocean south of us. But south of Nauvoo, Illinois, and Jackson County and all of the Midwest is a little body of water called the Gulf of Mexico. And Joseph Smith made it clear. If you're in the path of the oceans when they retreat to the poles in the events of the last days, you will die. Because it will be a tsunami of epic proportions. Did that kind of answer the question? Okay. More questions?
Well, if there's no others, you could explain the title of the book.
And the earth shall reel to and fro. What does that mean?
Yeah. Why don't you use it?
Well, I used it because it's scriptural, okay? And it makes a great title for a book. But it is meaningful. When Earth is moving along its orbit here, and as Joseph Smith describes it, one planet overtakes another. Not a head-on collision. He makes it clear no such thing as two colliding planets has ever been proposed. What does happen is that orbits coincide. Another mathematical term. So, this body moves up alongside the Earth, moving quicker or something, who knows what. But as the distance between them closes, some rather amazing things happen electromagnetically. At a distance, they are drawn together such that their orbits are distorted. Okay? So they instead of following a straight line, they bend the orbit, alter the orbit. I'm not illustrating this very well. And this orbit changes there, so the bodies approach one another. The very same forces actually pulling them together. Up to a point. But as the distance closes, it's just like two magnets on a tabletop. When you put the north and the south pole together, they attract. But if you put two like poles, north, north, south, south, they repel one another. So as this distance closes, because this is a more complex system, but it's the same basic idea. As they approach one another, the force begins to exert itself that will keep them apart. And so it reaches a point of balance, where the centrifugal, if you will, and the centripetal forces are in equilibrium. Equilibrium. And for a time, maybe indefinitely, depending upon the situation, but at least for a time, they move in tandem. But what does happen, and I'll illustrate that over here. Let's say this is north and south, and this is north and south. The plane of the ecliptic, that is the plane that most planets orbit in, is the equatorial plane of the sun. And when they approach one another, they tend to line up north to south. So north rotates this way, and south rotates this way. Now, if you're on the planet where north rotates that way, what you see is these stars here fall over the horizon. And you feel the earth reel. You realize it's, instead of, if you watch the stars at night, the motion is almost imperceptible. But in one of these events, these planets will tip 90 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic in the space of a few hours, 2 or 3. That's fast. You won't feel it. If you've watched my video, Joshua's Long Day, I explained that. But the secondary forces are going to be tremendous. You look out here at the Great Salt Lake, and you see the lake suddenly, mysteriously start moving up the valley and climb up the mountainside and disappear over the mountains. A whole lake. And it takes everything with it. Why? Because the earth, just Joseph Smith explains this beautifully. He says you get a bucket of water, you trip and fall and it spills. But if you swing it over your head, you can tip it upside down. It stays in place. You slow down a little bit, and that water's going to come out of there. He's explaining this phenomenon right here. So the Gulf of Mexico gets up and moves up the Mississippi River Valley at, I don't know, 600, 700 miles an hour. A wall of water 500 to 1,000 feet high. What's that going to do?
So has there been pole shifts like that before in the past? There has been, right?
What's that?
Those pole shifts, they've happened in the past?
They've happened in the past. They've happened in every planetary. That's what the parting of the Red Sea is all about. That's what it's all about.
Even science right now talks about how it moves.
Oh, yeah, in fact,
And in fact, a year or so ago, the New Age movement was talking about how it was going to flip and cause tons of problems. So they know it has happened. They just don't know why it happens.
Well, some
Well, it's because of the extra planets.
some believe it and some don't, you know. The pillar of fire and smoke was the head and tail of the planet/comet of the Exodus. And it exerted exactly these kinds of effects. When the sun and the moon stood still in Joshua's day, what he's talking about is as the earth turns, if the sun and the moon are in the right position, they look like they're staying in the right position while the earth rotates 90 degrees. If you're on the other side of the earth, it's nighttime and the sun doesn't come up. Again, going back to the ancient records, the Maya said, well, a day came when the sun didn't come up. And it didn't come up for many days. And I'm being a little flip, but they had an office pool, okay? And everybody guessed about where the sun was going to come up on the horizon. When it finally did, they knew it would because their historical records had told them this sort of thing happened before, I imagine. But they say when it finally did come up, it came up where nobody guessed it would. You see? So this is what it means about the earth reeling to and fro. It reels to do this alignment thing, and then when that ceases, it rights itself again.
What makes it go back?
Moving away from the other planet.
Sure, but it's turned, and the forces from the other planet turned it.
Oh, yeah.
What made the North Pole go back approximately?
The Earth's rotation and it, you know, is due to its own internal charge, and it lines itself with this equatorial plane, the plane of the ecliptic in the solar system. That's why the planets are all pretty much where they are, because that's where electromagnetism has put them. If you watch my classes, you'll learn that our sun originally down here captured this string of planets, the Earth being one of them, and we're all lined up with these plasma charges. And this is precisely what Joseph Smith drew for his illustration of the heavens, which I talk about in my third book, and we'll talk about in the next lecture. But they were all lined up like a shish kebab, and they approached the sun from a polar position. Eventually, they all fell into their own individual orbits in the equatorial plane. Why? Because that's where they electromagnetically want to be. That's where they're quote-unquote comfortable. The distance between the planets is determined by their magnetotails, the electrical charge in this plane of the ecliptic. The moon, our moon, orbits the Earth out here at a certain distance, because once a month, the magnetotail of the Earth, you've seen the illustrations of this in the solar wind. The wind is this way. They call this a bow shot, and it distorts the magnetosphere of the Earth, and it creates a cometary-like tail out here. Well, our tail extends right out to where the moon is. That magnetotail pushed the moon at some point to that position. The same thing happens with Venus. The sun is here, Venus is here, the Earth is here. I'm exaggerating, obviously. In the equatorial plane, and the magnetotail of Venus almost reaches the Earth, just tickles the Earth. And we find the same to be the case of all the planets. The spacing is determined by the net charge of each of the planets, positive or negative with relation to the charge of the solar wind, the environment that they move in.
So you're saying that it's probably pretty rare, if not impossible, for a planet to flip 90 degrees and stay 90 degrees?
Yeah, it will right itself.
It'll flip back up.
Mm-hmm.
know, it's been a little while since I've been in school, but isn't Uranus flipped?
Yeah. What does that tell you about Uranus? It's newly captured in our solar system. It's still trying to right itself. Or either that or the charge is such that it feels more comfortable at that position. Because the poles are, Steve's right, the poles are lined up in parallel with the plane of the ecliptic, which is where the solar wind is. The solar wind doesn't go out in all directions. It goes out in the plane of the ecliptic. It's a sheet current sheet. It's electric.
Or it just doesn't have enough energy out there to help correct it.
Well, it has quite a bit of energy. Yeah. I can't lean on that thing, it comes apart.
This is kind of getting off the topic, but you just answer a question I've been bugged with. The collision of these two planets or stuff, is that why science has such a hard time in the aging of the Earth? I mean, its impactions on one thing to another. Why do you get so many different theories, billions of years old? But
You talked about that in your first book?
Maybe you did.
A little bit. The idea that Earth is millions of years old is a form of denial. Here's the process. They look at a river running through the valley. And they look at the valley and they say, well, we know that river carries sediment away at a certain rate. It's measurable. Oh, sorry. It's measurable. So, if we measure how much material is being excavated every day by this river running through the valley, we can project that number back into the past because it'll be pretty consistent over time. Some stuff erodes more easily than other, but there's a medium. Then we can see that this river has been cutting through this valley. Take the Colorado River running through Grand Canyon, for example. It's been running through this valley for millions of years, carting the material off, gradually excavating all this stuff over time. And it's taken millions of years to do that. That is their concept. That's.
Yeah. But I mean, if you go back to your idea that the flood was the having of the thing, you'd have to almost throw all the theory out. Because
Yep.
it just doesn't, I mean, scientists age that thing, but just a simple question, but where do you think the dinosaur fits in on this, on the creation?
There were dinosaurs on the earth at one time.
Okay. And you think maybe the Earths collide and you get a petrification of
You get
layers?
all kinds of effects that modern science doesn't acknowledge. You've got, let me do a cross section here, okay? You have a valley. And believe me, the number of ways that electrical energy can excavate is really remarkable. You have a valley here, and say you have a small high point here, and a charge begins. Much like an electrical thunderbolt. Have you ever seen pictures of a golf course? You know the flag in the hole in the green is up kind of high, and so very often they're struck by lightning, and they create this dendritic pattern. As the ions and the thunderbolt leads from the ground to the cloud. It's not the other way around, typically. As all the ions rush to this touchdown point, and illustrated here is the flag, they rush in from all directions, but they follow preferential paths. Where one ion is gone, others prefer to go. So it creates this dendritic structure with the flag in the in the cup, right in the middle. And they rush here and they shoot up from what's called the current touchdown point. And in so doing, in an ordinary thunderstorm lightning bolt, all it does is kill the grass and excavate a little of the dirt, but not much. But in these planetary encounters like this, where it goes on for hours, maybe days or weeks, you see, then these processes have enough time to work. And you get a valley like this, and it begins to excavate. And it, because it's preferential, now it's established a path here. And it's lofting, the ions and the electrons are moving at a high rate of speed. They etch the material away from the ground and loft it into space. And it goes up in these plumes. In planetary scientists say, well, those are water plumes, like on Enceladus, for example. They're water geysers or water volcanoes. What they really are is electrical discharge material being excavated from the surface and lofted into the air. Some of it reaches escape velocity and sails off in space. Some of it falls down in rains of hot stones, as in the Exodus. But what happens is it begins to machine away this material, and it works from an edge. So you get these long excavated features that can be miles deep, like the Grand Canyon or Valles Marineris. And this current, if you look down on it from the top, this current will meander and create a great chasm on both sides where the material is being excavated skyward from the edges. At the same time, in other places where the land is underwater, this is water and everything's under, and there's just a little bit sticking up. When the conditions are right, there'll be all the dust and debris in the air from this phenomenon, and the electrical charge will be moving that material downward, and it will build on whatever's sticking out of the water. And it creates layer after layer after layer after layer of material in one place. And so those layers that they say took billions of years to deposit with that river carrying it away happens in a few hours. How do we know this? Well, Native Americans recorded it. They said they watched the mountains build right in situ, right there. Or they watched the canyons carved.
There's bigger canyons on Mars than there's parts of the New York. They look like the Grand Canyon.
So does that answer your question?
Well, no, I just kind of been struggling with this for a while, because I've got my own ideas I'm probably sharing here, but the concept is that God in the creation, the God that we believe in, maybe not mainly responsible for the creation of the dinosaurs, another God. Because if he created the animals as he did, and there's order in the creation, the animal life came later. And I subscribe, and I believe that earth life as we know is almost 6,000 or 7,000 here.
Right.
But we're aged before, and this kind of gets into the whole process of creation. And my personal belief is that this was created from other planets, and other gods created, quote, their animals. Yeah. And this earth is fragments of all that God, when he created this earth, didn't create matter. He just organized matter. And like when Joseph Smith taught, he brought different places together. Well, some of those other places had dinosaurs and the aging and the prehistoric,
I've heard that before.
And then put this earth together as it is.
Yeah.
And then he took it from here and created his animal life and his thing.
The way I understand the way electricity works is it organizes material, but it organizes it out of small bits and pieces. It wouldn't be taking entire animals and species and big, large chunks. What I think Joseph Smith was trying to convey is that the material from other worlds was used to create our world.
That's what
But not chunks large enough that you could preserve a dinosaur skeleton. The dinosaurs lived here at one time before man was placed on the earth. And that's probably the more likely answer. That's my opinion.
yeah, I guess we'll difference.
What the thing is, what you're saying is that your view of creation is that, for the most part, what's recorded in Genesis is a literal story, because you're trying to fit the pieces into that. In reality, the creation is what mankind remembers as an event early in its history that they call the creation. And the prophets used that event, just as I've described here, using this common denominator that everybody could understand to explain how mankind came to be on this earth.
Well, I mean, basic question, you believe mankind's basically 6,000 to 7,000 years old?
No.
Okay, we probably agree.
I have no idea.
I mean, from a scriptural standpoint.
Not even from a scriptural standpoint. The scriptures are not explicit enough. The scriptures are symbolic. Look, when the prophets use the numbers, when you understand the common denominator, you understand why they use the number 4, why they use the number 7, 3, 10, and then they multiply them, you know. 10 times 4 is 40, times 1,000 is 40,000. It's a symbolic use of numbers.
Well, that's 7 times 7 is the same thing. It's
Same thing.
It's the idea, it's just more that you get the concept. But, well, we'll talk about it later.
Well, here's a course of action I suggest for you. Look at what I have presented in my lessons, okay? Then determine after you see it from a different perspective. You know, well, there's no use in...
I mean, that's where science and religion are having the biggest crossfire.
That's right.
Science will not accept the fact that man theologically is a 6,000 or 7,000 years. But if you go back to the dispensations of time, where the timelines that are given scripturally, we have to accept somewhere along the line the prophets. I mean, we argue over a few years when the second coming's coming.
Yeah.
And Joe Smith said you're wasting your time with that. But
And the same would be true of trying to impute any timeline to the past. Exactly the same thing. Science is wrong. Religion is wrong. To the degree that Mormons accept mainstream Christianity, we are wrong. Creation described in Genesis was a way of explaining how the world came to be where it was and why we are where we are. All right?
Yeah,
but it's just like everything else that the prophets taught. They use this common denominator. They use the cosmological traditions. That's why Satan is a serpent.
okay. Well, no, I was going to ask you a question. But I mean, you rely quite heavily on Moses here. But if we keep to accept the Moses and the order of the prophets, and you have the Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Christ, the 6 dispensations, we have to timeline that up somewhere along the line. And if we accept Moses as basically 2,000 years before Christ, and the timeline from Moses to Adam is 2,000 years, we're going to have to accept them. We might be off, hair here or there. But basically, then if you're saying that before Moses, there's no timeline. I mean, if
Not as we see
two
it.
different timelines.
That it's all of this is projecting the current onto the things onto the past. When John talks about the 7 seals, we interpret that to be dispensations. And we figure there's some kind of a dividing line between them. But that's just for frame of reference. taking it as some kind of a literal calendar of events. This one started here and it ran to there, and then the next one started and ran. That's taking literal what was meant to be symbolic. We can't know.
I think
Abraham was alive during Melchizedek.
Yeah, you have the.
Though we talk about Abraham as a head, but Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. So that would somewhat suggest that Abraham was not a head.
Again, the suggestion that I have is look at my research, because you've not been exposed to that. Okay, you're beginning to be exposed to it, but you've not seen how it works. One of my lessons is called From Adam to Armageddon. And I give a basic timeline of what history was about. And mankind, in that timeline I show that Earth was created here, and time began, and at some point along here, Adam and Eve were placed on the earth. Were placed on the earth. And of course then it continues. And then there was this catastrophic event. Adam and Eve were here I don't know how long. And then there was this catastrophic event that all cultures saw. All the descendants of Adam and Eve saw this event, and they remembered it as the creation. And that's what they called it. But it was not the beginning of this planet. This planet existed long before the event that all cultures remember as the creation. Evidence for that is in the Genesis account itself. What was the first thing that was created after the land?
Light.
Light. When were the sun, the moon, and the stars created in that sequence? Days later. What was this light? You see, the event is not what we take it to be. It is an account. Just like Noah's flood. We think it was just a big flood. It was a catastrophic event. Yeah, there were floods, but that was just part of it. There were 7 days of light before the flood occurred. What caused that? There's a lot more to the story than has been communicated to us, because the story is based on this stuff, the cosmological stuff. It's not meant to be an accurate account of how our world came into being and how men and women were placed on it. It's not.
So are you saying the light was the electrical discharge between the planets?
Sure, it was before if the Earth had not yet fallen into the orbit, as Brigham Young says, that it's in now, then something else had to light the Earth. How do these lights work?
Well, didn't Christ stay without, he was in the presence of God before they transgressed, basically, right? So the light of God would have probably lit that whole planet.
Well, that's a metaphor.
Oh,
What is the light of God? Is it different than this light? No. No. It's the same light.
Says that
That's created by a plasma. And it's created by electrons excited in a noble gas as electricity passes through it. And the same thing happens in space. And that same electricity that lights space, illuminates the suns, causes matter to accumulate and create planets. In space, there are these things called currents. And they're many parsecs wide. Do you know what a parsec is? Kind of a science fiction term. It's a big chunk of space. Bigger than you can really imagine, okay? Imagine Imagine the Mississippi River flowing along here, and you're standing right here on the edge of it, watching. And you see millions of gallons a minute flow by your feet. But it's moving very slowly and very quiet. And you do not perceive precisely how much water is actually moving. But then at some point down the road here, the river narrows like it does in the Colorado because of the mountains around it. And that same amount of water that was slowly moving by you is now trying to get through a space that's only a fraction of the space that this is flowing in. So what does the water do?
Speeds up.
It accelerates. Why? Because you're trying to get the same amount of water through across the same distance, but with just like a nozzle on a hose. It creates a great deal of force. It accelerates, and as a result, it agitates.
Hydraulics.
Yeah, hydraulics. Plasmas operate. Magnetohydrodynamics is the big word for it. Plasma works very much like water. It narrows, and here where it narrows, the plasma now, not water, is so excited that it produces light. Just like the river produces white water. So here's this current in space. They're called Birkeland currents. They're actually in pairs. Called Birkeland after Christian Birkeland, who discovered them 100 years ago. First described them. And he described them because of the aurora borealis. He said that's a version of these currents in space. But where the water is squeezed down into a narrow canyon because the rock won't allow it to cut further away. The same thing happens in space, and it produces light. But it also produces tremendous electromagnetic fields. And those fields have a focus or foci. I think it's spelled with 2 lines. Points along the stream where material accumulates at a prodigious rate. And when the current quenches, well, it never completely quenches, but when it quenches in space, this current runs through these planets and it keeps them lined up, just like I described with the plus and the minus business all along here. So you get a stack of planets like Joseph Smith illustrated. They're some distance apart, but the same forces that keep them in line also prevent them from colliding or moving away, keep them in a fixed position. And they'll remain that way until the current quenches entirely, in which case they all go their own separate way. And like Brigham Young said, our earth was created near the throne of God. That doesn't mean literally the throne of God. It means our earth was created nearby this planet in the heavens that was thought to be the throne of God. He's just using a metaphor. Our earth was created in a stacked alignment, in this shish kebab arrangement. And it only fell out of that arrangement during the time of Adam and Eve. Up until the time of Adam and Eve, and even afterwards, it remained in this shish kebab arrangement. It's called the patriarchal age. And the creation is remembered as an event that happened early in the patriarchal age. And the language describing the creation is, interestingly enough, borrowed from an event later that we know as Noah's flood. When the earth fell out of this arrangement. And so earth's fall became the metaphor for the fall of mankind. Great comment. I suggest.
Don't you think the fall of mankind would be after the transgression took place, and the fall, where Adam could no longer abide the presence of God, and then there was a physical change, and
That's what you've been taught your whole life.
well, no,
You've got an interesting twist on it, but you're talking about the standard Christian view of creation.
well, I'll talk to you later about
Okay.
one thing there.
Anyway, this is stuff I cover in my lessons. I can't even begin to describe it to you. But you go, just for the sake of the folks at home, for the sake of the folks at home, you go to www.mormonprophecy.com. Okay? mormonprophecy.com. And you'll find a series of little boxes there, and one of them says online classes. You click on that, there's a description of the classes, there's a free preview you can watch, and it'll show you where to go and how to sign up for the classes. It's 16 hours of instruction. There's no way in 10 minutes or 15 minutes I'm going to be able to elaborate this in such a way that you can begin to understand. You've got to start at the beginning of those 16 hours and work your way through it. Is there any other way, do you think? Brian, you've seen it.
No, I think
What
it's
about
separate
you,
with the-
Stephen?
Oh, yeah, I've seen them all. And he has ones on Revelation too. The visual effects, pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? It's literally true with this. The pictures make it so much more clear.
What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I went through all those, and then I went through the 11 Revelations. Probably learned more in those than reading hundreds of hours of books.
What was it like for you?
Awesome.
Awesome? Well, I like that.
Yeah. So just take it.
For an old fuddy-duddy like me who just likes to drone on, that's pretty impressive. Awesome.
It's all summed up into one word.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, that's the point. The books are just an introduction to the idea that the world is not as we've been taught it is, folks. Joseph Smith gave us a model that is entirely different than the one that we embrace today. Most Latter-day Saints have no idea that Joseph Smith taught anything about cosmology. They just look at the temple and the stars and the planets and they say, well, that's pretty.
Yeah, if it's not taught in Sunday school, they don't hear about it.
No,
Might be,
and
you
that's
don't hear much of
that's why this room is full of people. They're just knocking down my door to get in here to find out about this.
More people watch it online.
Yeah.
And the reason we're recording them is because there are a lot of people online who can't be here that would like to be. So this is the primary reason. Well, we've got to finish up. Any more quick questions before I close? I urge you to go to the classes. I urge you to take them. You'll not find anyone else in or out of the church that is willing to go through the book of Revelation and give an explanation for every verse in the book. I'm willing to do it because I'm convinced that this is the correct way to understand the scriptures. The commonalities that we find in ancient cultures testify to that. The cosmological symbolism in modern Revelation and in our temples further confirms it. So, that's all I have to say about that. If you'll join us in a couple of weeks, we'll go through book number 3 in the trilogy.
What day is that going to be?
2
2 weeks from today.
Same place?
No, it's
I'll
at
tell you
the,
after.
it's at the Mill Creek Library, I believe.
Okay.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah.